everyone. My name is David Khourshid, and I'm so glad to be in a country where everyone else knows how to pronounce my last name better than I do. I think it's Khourshid, or Khourshid. Anyway, I'm at David K. Piano pretty much everywhere online, GitHub, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. And I am the founder of Stately.ai, which is a visual application modeling platform. And yeah, before that I was at Microsoft, but this isn't about me. This is honestly about you and how you use React, and especially the useEffect hook. So, how many of you are all just happy to be here? Right? Most of you? All right, great. How many of you are confused? Like, why are we getting rid of useEffect? Right? Oh, you're excited. Okay. Well, this is the wrong smiley for that. How about this smiley when most of you realized that it's not lunchtime yet? I saw a lot of you leaving, and it's like, okay, well, how many of you feel like this? Do you know what this smiley is? This is the frustrated React developer smiley. So, yeah, obviously, today we are going to talk about our favorite hook, right? Not that one, but this one, useEffect, which, some of you might know well, some of you are, new to React, and it's, just one of those sort of intimidating hooks, and, some of you might be used to it, of course, and some of you might be like me and say, you know what, F this, I don't like this hook. But honestly, if you're struggling with the useEffect hook, just like I am, and I was, don't worry, even senior React developers struggle with it too. And so you might have a large dependency array or a nasty if statement inside of your hook. It's typical, it's normal. Trust me, we're gonna see a few examples of that today. And it's just a really awkward hook, okay? So we're gonna be talking about useEffect, how to use it, how not to use it in this talk. And also, even if you know useEffect, you're like, okay, I understand how to do pretty much everything. I know that useEffect, you do something inside the hook, and then you return a cleanup function, and then you might have dependencies inside of it. Like you might have been used to using useEffect in so many of your applications where it's pretty much second nature to you now. But React 18 came out, and now this executes twice in strict mode. How many of you have actually run into this problem, or is it just a me problem? Okay, so a few of you, a lot of you are like meekly putting your hands up. Yes, this is sort of a weird problem. And so I'm going to talk about that too, but React is actually doing that on purpose. So the main summary of my talk, if you want to just read the slide and then go get lunch if you want, it's that useEffect is not for all effects. Now, some of this, some of you might be leaving more confused now because it's right in the name. If I have an effect, doesn't it go inside of useEffect? Well, not exactly. So first of all, let's talk to the past about class components and how we used to use React. We had lifecycle hooks like componented mount, and then when something happens, either the state is changed or we have a prop update, we have a componented update, and then when the component's unmounted, we could hook into that with component will unmount, and these are three areas that we use to just hook effects into. So now what do? Well, we have useEffect where we put a componented mount with an empty dependency array, and then when something updates, we might do it based on the dependency array, or just maybe leave the dependency array out. It gets a little bit fuzzy. And then for component will unmount, we have that cleanup function that we could use. And it honestly doesn't look clean. A lot of developers have actually asked for lifecycle hooks, but honestly, that's not the mental model that we want. And by the way, let me just preface. Most of the things that I talk about in this presentation are actually not my opinion, but they are they're what the React maintainers are saying. So that's why I'm putting their tweets up on the screen so that you all don't come complaining to me. You could, complain to them. Just kidding, don't do that. They're very nice people. Here's another gotcha. I will never comprehend why the default behavior of useEffect is an infinite loop. So I don't know if you've all run into this. You're probably seeing where this is going, right? Set count, count plus 1. We're setting count in the useEffect. What could go wrong? Well, a lot of things can go wrong. So useEffect is not a state setter. You should be keeping setting state outside of useEffect. Throughout this talk, we're also going to be talking about some of the new beta docs that are coming out. And these were released literally late last week. So all of this is pretty brand new. And so one of the pitfalls it mentions is that you should not be setting state in useEffect. And of course, we'll be talking about patterns for avoiding that. And the problem is that new React developers, they'll go to the docs, the official React docs, not the beta ones, and they will see an example like this where there is no dependency array. And so as seasoned React professionals, you might say, well, whenever you create a useEffect, you should include a dependency array. But guess what? In the documentation, that's all the way at the bottom, and it's a tip. So it's really, really hidden down there, and honestly, it should be up in the forefront, which is why the React beta docs actually say, hey, make sure that you have a dependency array. All right, so useEffect, again, we have an effect, we're doing something, and then we have a dependency array where whenever anything in the dependency array changes, we're going to clean up the previous effect, and then we're going to rerun the new effect. And so some of you might be saying that, yes, we have to use a useEffect hook for this because it's the declarative way of doing effects. Except it's not, because when we think about imperative, we think about, for executing effects, when something happens, the user clicks a button, we get data from the API, some other signal causes something to change, execute this effect. We think, okay, this is the imperative approach, and we know in React, imperative is bad, we should do functional everything. So the declarative approach with the dependency array and with useEffect is when something happens, it will cause the state to change, and depending on which parts of that state or the props were changed, this effect should be executed. But only if some condition is true. We have to make sure that we're filtering out, because we might have a lot of things in that dependency array that are changing. So we have to say only if this subset of these changes happen should this effect reoccur. Oh, and also React may execute it again for some future reason. I still don't completely understand the reason. Something about off-screen API, maybe Kent knows better. I don't know. But only in strict mode, which you shouldn't disable, by the way, for some future reason. Honestly, strict mode is there to prevent you from making mistakes that you were making in React pre-15, 16. So the whole class component API. And honestly, if you're writing modern React, most of strict mode will actually not apply to you. So that's something important to keep in mind. But if we're doing useEffect today and we're using it everywhere, we might think like, you know what? useEffect is not that bad. We have useEffect, we do something, we clean it up, and then when something changes, it executes again. But this is the reality. We have a big nasty if statement in there. We have a bunch of dependency arrays, and chances are we're going to forget the cleanup function. So these are some real examples from some companies. I'm not going to reveal the companies, but I just found these examples online, and there's so many of these examples where we have exactly that. A nasty dependency array, no cleanup, and some, complicated if statements. And this one even has a nested if statement, which is interesting. Let's see, there's another one over here, another nasty dependency array. Even if it is a short example, it's hard to really explain what is going on in this useEffect. Here's a bigger example. We have a lot of variables that start with is, which are my favorite kinds of variables, just Boolean flags everywhere. The useEffect is also down here. Use SWR infinite. I'm not sure which company uses that, but anyway, so dependencies really feel like the wrong mental model for effects. And so let's get back to this issue too. React 18 running effects twice on mount in strict mode. So how do we fix this, or how do we avoid this problem? Well, it's not really anything to fix or avoid, and I'll tell you exactly what React is doing here. First of all, we're mounting the component, and so the effect is going to run, and then React simulates a dismount or an unmount, and so that's going to clean up the effect, and then immediately after it's going to remount the components, and so the effect is going to rerun. And so honestly, this double execution of effects is not really React saying, hey, I'm going to introduce bugs into your code base. It's more React saying that you might be doing some effects and useEffects that are actually not supposed to be there. So it's more like an eviction notice. And so at this point, useEffect might feel like useDefect or useFootgun. So, and this is honestly what it felt like to me, both as someone developing applications and as a library maintainer, because, and I'll explain about, one of the libraries that I maintain with XState, but we had to deal with this problem too, because we were surprised that things were executing twice when they weren't supposed to be. Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, well, what is useEffect really for then? And so useEffect is for synchronization. In fact, it should have been called useSynchronize or useSync or something like that, but the idea is that you are synchronizing something to an external, not an external store, but some sort of external system. So that could be, an event listener or some observable or just something like that. And so I have another example over here. Let's say that we're creating a store and we want to just fetch item data and the item ID could change. Well, we could subscribe to that. And so we're synchronizing with an external system, right? So we're calling this subscription. We're making sure to clean up. And the only dependency we should have is the item ID. So one telltale sign where you know that you are probably using useEffect the right way is that your dependency array is light and you're doing some sort of subscription inside of it. That is your feel-good moment for like, yes, this is the right use case for useEffect. And React actually talks about two different types of effects. It talks about effects with a capital E in the new beta docs, and also events, or these side effects, what I'm going to call action effects. And so just to visualize the difference here, these activity effects, or the capital E, are basically that synchronization between your components and some sort of external system. And then we have the other type of effects, which are action effects. In these, we're not synchronizing anything. We're just doing something. So we're either console.logging, sending analytics, making a post request, or just things like that. And so the idea is that useEffect needs to be able to unmount and remount, and so stop and restart that effect so that everything stays in sync. So again, useEffect is for synchronization. So with that said, where do action effects go? So we know that you can't have any side effects in render, and also using useEffect is really just the awkward place to put them. So like, where else could they go? Outside of the component, like what exactly does that look like? So remembering the React 18 double execution, we know that when something happens caused by an event handler, a state change, or something like that, we'll have some effect happen because it's synchronized currently with the component rendering. And so the problem with that is, like I said, React is allowed to say, hey, I am going to unmount it and remount it again, and as a result, those effects which you thought were safe are going to execute multiple times. So where should these go? Probably here. And so now it doesn't matter how many times your components unmount and remount, your effects are only going to happen once during that event handler. So action effects happen outside of rendering and inside of those event handlers. So, I said event handlers, like for example, if we're submitting a form, we'll submit that data, but this is only sort of correct and sort of the mental model, but if you take anything away from this talk, action effects go in event handlers. So let's talk about the mental model a little bit, and this will get cool, I promise you. So React popularized the idea that UI is a function of state, and Redux popularized the idea that the next state is derived from the state and the events that just happened. The problem with these two models is that it doesn't really leave any room for effects. So where do effects go? Well, here's an alternative model, and by alternative I mean this has existed since, for many, many, many decades, and it's that given the current state and the events that just occurred, we're going to get a tuple instead of the next state and any effects that should be executed. Now, if you know Haskell or functional programming, you might actually recognize this as the Elm architecture or some other things. So I'm going to show you a demo and just give you an idea of exactly how this works and how effects can actually be part of state transitions. So let's say that you have an example app. And so this actually doesn't work yet because what we want to do is we want this video to go from this mini view to a full view and then start playing. And then when the video is over, we want it to stop and go back to the mini view, or when we press the escape key, or when we click the video again, we want it to stop playing and go back. All right, so instead of juggling useEffect and everything like that, what I'm going to do instead is, you guessed it, use a state machine. So don't be intimidated. This is not live coding. This is live diagramming. So it's a little bit easier on the eyes. So I'm going to add another state over here. We're going to have a full state. And so this is going to be when the video is shown full screen. All right, so how do we go back and forth between these? Well, we toggle it. So we could toggle that. And so we know that, when we toggle back, so I'll do this right here. All right, and obviously this is a very simple state machine, and this isn't exactly the point of why you would use a state machine, but one relatively unknown benefit of using a state machine is expressing effects. So we know that when we toggle from mini to full, we want the video to play. So I'm gonna add an action over here, which is just video.play. And so when we toggle back, I want the video to pause. So I'm just gonna type here, video.pause. And there's other things called invocations, and so these are effects that are pretty much long-lived, and so you could think about them as the original use case for useEffect. These are long-lived effects where you have to synchronize with them, and so there's two of them that we're going to listen to. We're going to listen to when the video ends, and we're also going to listen to keydown.escape because we want to know when the escape event happens. We should actually go back to mini. So I'm going to do that. So key.escape. Didn't want that new state. And also we are going to listen to video.ended. So the idea is that, and I'll just simulate this, we're in the mini state. When we toggle, we go to full. And then when any of these three things happen, either the video ends, an escape key is pressed, or we toggle back to mini, we want to go back to the mini state, but we also want the video to pause. So we know that pausing the video is going to happen in any of these events, and so this is one of the cool parts about state machines, is that instead you could simplify this and add an exit action. So I'm just going to put video.pause over here, and that way we don't need to do it here. All right, so I made a nice diagram. You're thinking, all right, this is pretty cool. I could have done this in Excalidraw or in Miro or Whimsical or Lucidcharts or whatever the heck you use. But instead, we're doing it here because this actually exports to code, and hopefully this works. But if I paste the exact same code I copied over here, and I have the actions already baked in here. So for video.play, we call video ref.code.play. Hopefully it works, and so when we click, we go full screen. When I press escape, go back, click. When the video ends, it should go back to mini again. And there you go. We live coded without, without coding. All right, so this is all to say, when do effects happen? Effects, there's many places effects could happen, right? Middleware, callbacks, Segas, reaction syncs, monads, things like that. No, they happen in state transitions always. And so where do these action effects go? Not event handlers, but in state transitions, which happen to be executed at the same time as event handlers. So again, if you take one thing from this talk, it's that you should be moving your action effects as close as possible to when the event occurs. So you could use a state machine if you want, or for now, you could start with just putting it inside of event handlers when you can. Now, the following things, and I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to breeze through these, and you all are pretty hungry. So we're going to talk about the React docs and what they say about this, basically this whole talk in a single page in the docs where you might not need an effect. And they point out several areas where you could refactor your code to not use an effect. First of all, like I said, you don't need an effect and you don't need useEffect for handling user events. Instead, move it to the event handler. So this is an example, submitting data. We are putting it all inside of this useEffect. We're just tracking so many variables. And so this isLoading variable is the one that's actually triggering the effect, which doesn't really make sense. You should be thinking as a developer, when the user submits a form, that's when we post the event. Not when the user submits a form, we change the isLoading variable, and depending on what the isLoading variable value is, we start sending it. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So the idea is that instead, put it in form on submit. And of course, this could get a little crazy because you have to handle errors in loading and things like that. So I highly recommend you move this to a hook instead. And so that hook, I really like this, this pattern where the first argument of your tuple is a state, and the second argument is something where you could actually communicate back with the hook. Because that gives you a lot of flexibility for synchronizing without having to juggle a lot of use effects and use states and things like that. And so this looks a lot like use reducer, but a little secret, you can imagine that this use checkout form is actually executing effects when the event happens instead of wrapping it in useEffect. Also, you don't need useEffect for transforming data. This is something that seems obvious, but a lot of us accidentally do this in our code bases, so this is something to just keep in mind. So for example, I'm trying to get the total of all of these items, and so I have two variables over here, which is items and total, and so whenever the items change, we set the total to the sum of those items' prices, right? Well, you don't actually need useEffect for that. Just put that right in there, and honestly, this is going to be fast. A lot of you get use memo happy, where it's like, I think this is going to be a slow operation. Computers are faster than you think. Honestly, only use memo when you really, really, really need to, and you see that your app is sort of lagging a bit. All right? So you also don't need useEffect for communicating with parents. And so this is what I mean. And I've done this pattern a lot too. So for example, when we click this button, we're toggling a quick view for looking at a product, and depending on is open, we're going to call on open or on close so that our parents knows, hey, this component, this product was opened or closed. You don't need to do that, and we could use, again, the event handler strategy, where we're putting it inside of an event handler instead. And so, we're setting the state, but we're also, checking what the next state is going to be and calling those right when the event happens. So we're also saving a potential rendering step, and you're limiting the amounts of renders that happen due to changing the state and notifying the parents of any changes. You could also move this to a hook if you want to, and again, this is just a cleaner way of expressing the same thing, again, without using useEffect. And so you're going to see examples like this in the React beta documentation too. Here's another fun one. You don't need useEffect for subscribing to external stores. And if you were at the meetup last night, I actually went more, I did more of a deep dive into this one, but the useSync external store is a really great hook that's now baked into React 18. So you could use it directly, and it's a magical hook. It really simplifies the way that we do a lot of common things in React. So in this example, I have no dependencies, but I still need to do that typical useEffect use case where I subscribe to something, and then I set state based on the values that I'm subscribing to. And so this is honestly a lot of boilerplate. We have to use state, we have to useEffect, we have to make sure to clean it up. We're really listening to some sort of external store, which is that store API over there. This can be cleaned up using useSync external store, and here's what that looks like. That's it. So useSync external store, which you could import directly from React, it takes 3 arguments. First is a way to subscribe to the external store. Second is a way to get the latest state. And so this is to prevent tearing if you're using this in multiple components. And the third one is for server rendering, just to give the server an initial value. So instead of saying that connected is true by default, you put it as the third argument over there. And so xState uses that useSync external store. And so it treats these state machines as external stores. And like I showed in the previous demo, you could express all of these effects inside of that so that your external stores could be what handles effects and also manages states and receives events. So here's probably the biggest one, and I'm glad I still have a little bit of time for this, because it's been the biggest question and one of the biggest sources of frustration. You don't need useEffect for fetching data, believe it or not. So here's a very, very common pattern that we do. And honestly, you might still have to do this depending on your use cases, the version of React you're using, limitations, etc. Also the framework that you're using. But we have this isCancelled equals false. And this is sort of just a muscle memory thing that we have to do whenever we fetch data inside of useEffects, because we're going to get our items. And if that was canceled because something changes, oh, I just realized I forgot a dependency array. So this is going to be a very expensive API call. So we set items, if isCancelled is false, and we're still allowed to make that promise. But there's another way. And so what React's recommendation is to actually use frameworks. So hopefully I got the syntax correct, but if you went to Kent's talk earlier today, he talked about this too, where, I love this. You see no use effects in here, and also if you saw Ryan's talk from Reactathon, you could see that he was just removing use effect after use effect and just putting it in loaders. So Remix has a native way, a built-in way of handling the loading of data before your component mounts, because fetching data during component mounting is too late. You want to start fetching before that, and so that is render as you fetch, or fetch then render. Those are the patterns that React talks about. There's also Next.js, get server-side props if you're using that. Same idea. You're fetching, server-side, and then you're giving it to the component. Now, some of you might not have the ability to do this, so instead, you might use something like React Query. And I highly recommend you use React Query with useQuery, because it's going to do caching, and it allows you to prefetch those queries too. So you could actually start fetching before your component mounts. So highly recommend this library. And I'll also talk about some of the problems that Dan Abramov actually recently mentioned about useEffect and fetching inside of it. First of all, race conditions. If you forget that is loading or is canceled Boolean, then you might have race conditions with multiple fetch calls happening at the same time. Also, there's no instant back button. So you're going to, maybe load some data, and then when you go back a screen, because you're fetching in your component, you're going to see all of those loading spinners again. I hate seeing loading spinners, especially if it's like, I know that you have this data. Like, why are you showing me that you're loading it? It's somewhere in there. Just show it to me again. Also, no initial HTML content. Like Kent's talked about again, you're just going to see an empty HTML shell with a bunch of loading spinners. That's not a really good user experience. And also, we're chasing waterfalls because we're going to have the parents component fetch something, and then the child component won't even get a chance to fetch until the parent component is done fetching. So it's just really not a good user experience, and you should start thinking about moving your fetches away from useEffect. So this is all in the React documentation, which does not have a really pretty URL, but just search for it. Look for Dan Abramov's tweets. I'm sure he tweeted about it somewhere there. So also, real quick, you don't need useEffect for initializing global singletons. You could just do it. So here's one of those. You could use a ref. Don't really recommend doing that. I'm just going to skip ahead to the good part, which is just call it outside the component. Some of you might be complaining, like, hey, what about SSR? Check for the window. What about testing? Wrap it in a function. Just, you don't need to put this in useEffect. So, in summary, hopefully in 20 seconds, UseEffect is for synchronization. State transitions are what trigger effects, which means you put them in your event handlers when you can. Action effects go inside those event handlers. You should render as you fetch. And also, you should model your effects with state machines just because it's a really cool thing to do. So thank you, ReactNext. Boom, right on time.